Mic on? Very good. It's great to be here, everybody. I'm so very glad to be here and not stuck in an airport for another day. I had a rough day yesterday, rough morning, but I'm here at last. Caroline pointed out that I'm a grazing lands pollinator biologist. I also work with the NRCS as a partner biologist. I want to point out that I have, up until now, seldom worked with rights of way. So at times during this talk, where I'm not talking about rights of way, I'm talking more about rangeland, I'm hoping that you'll be able to apply the same type of ecological knowledge, if there is any, to rights of way. So let's start. Principle number 1. Many native wildflowers regrow following mechanical disturbance, such as mowing, such as grazing, such as disturbance from large machinery, if given time. So a big factor in vegetation management for pollinators, for habitat, is giving them enough time to recover. And this is a photo of a native hay meadow in eastern Kansas. Chip Taylor can probably guess the county, or if maybe he'd be off by a single county. It's Anderson County, a county full of beautiful, beautiful native tallgrass prairie hay meadows that are mowed every year or two. And the fact that you have a delay in the mowing for a whole year or two gives the plants great time to recover. A corollary of principle number 1, therefore, is make sure you give floral resources time to recover. Principle number 2, general principle number 2 of this talk. There is no perfect season to manage for pollinators. There's, of course, an immense diversity of insect pollinator species, which all have different life histories, which means that when you're doing something good for one, you're probably doing something bad for another. And there's no way to avoid that. There's no perfect time if you want to consider pollinators in general. So a corollary of that is to try to mix things up. Try to vary the timing of your management practices, of your mowing, of your grazing, of larger disturbances. If you can, split your rights of way into different units and disturb them at different times. Rather than treating 10, 20 miles all at the same time, maybe you can split it up into 4-mile segments, mow one in June, one in July, one in August, something like that. Or at a given site, maybe this year mow it in April, next year in May, next year in June. Mix things up. And by doing that, that will help you maintain the full diversity of pollinators. What are some of the effects of mowing? Obviously, as folks know, mowing can kill pollinators in larval stages, and it most certainly does remove floral resources. Excessive mowing can reduce wildflower abundance and diversity over time, without a doubt. So chronic excessive mowing will really cause plant communities to become depauperate. So best management practices for mowing. If you can, and this is very, very difficult for lots of users to do, lots of groups to do, try to delay mowing until after the first frost. If you do that, you're providing a very long bloom period for our pollinators. That, of course, do that if you can. Try to mow 10 inches or higher so that plants are able to recover more quickly. And again, this is coming from a pollinator guy whose main job it is, works for an organization whose mission it is to optimize, maximize pollinator populations and invertebrate populations. And knowing that that's not the mission of your agency for most of you. But in an ideal world, try to do some of these things or work toward them. Along roadsides, of course, if you can, limit mowing to no more than twice the growing season. Elsewhere, if possible, mow only as often as needed to knock back woody veg. Some of the benefits of reduced mowing: it saves money, it allows wildflowers to grow, reduces soil compaction, it protects grassland birds. So in this site, of course, you can see butterfly milkweed blooming profusely on a Kansas roadside. Monarch Joint Venture has produced this wonderful map, and I think it's being updated now. But even in this current form, very, very, very helpful, very useful. It helps instruct people on the timing of when to mow. And I'm going to focus on my region, the region in yellow, which would be Kansas and northern Oklahoma. And it points out that if you can mow, if you want to mow an area that's good monarch habitat and has milkweeds, mow really early, or mow after October 15th, after most of the monarchs have migrated through on their way to Mexico. But in parentheses, there's this interesting little window, July 1st through July 20th. And in my area, it turns out that is a wonderful time to mow. Now, that's when most hay meadow operators are going to mow anyway. They like to mow around the 4th of July. But that happens to be ideal for monarchs. Why? For one reason, where I live, we have no monarchs in July. They're up here. They're in Minnesota. There are virtually no monarchs in Oklahoma, not that many in Texas either, in mid-July. But the other exciting thing is that we have milkweed down there that you don't have up here, that monarchs love. And this milkweed, if you mow in early July, this milkweed comes back really, really strong. It goes dormant. If you don't mow it, it just goes dormant. The great majority of them go dormant. But if you do mow it in early July, this is what they look like 4 weeks later. And it provides an enormous amount of food for monarch butterflies, which show up in our area in October. And of course, there are lots of studies going on right now, been published recently, about mowing of common milkweed up north and how that can be beneficial to monarchs. Now I want to talk about grazing. 2 different contexts of grazing to consider. One context, you've got a right of way, and you want to see if you can use some grazers or browsers to help you manage it. The second context, which is what I deal with primarily, you have a range or pasture with livestock, and a right of way happens to go through it. So context 1, you've got right of ways and you want to manage them with grazers. Well, I have no personal experience with that, but I did find an interesting study from Washington DOT, and they looked at goats, and they found that overall, it wasn't that great of an idea to use goats. Of course, goats eat just about everything, and so that can be really, really good to get rid of noxious vegetation. But the big problem was the cost. You have to fence in those goats. So in the only scenario where having goats made sense for them were areas where they already had fencing, like around stormwater management basins. Context number 2, rangeland. That's what I work in primarily. Some of the benefits of grazing, of course, it can reduce grass dominance, thereby increasing the number of wildflowers. It might do that. And it certainly does typically increase bare ground for ground nesting bees. So that first point, reduce grass dominance and increase wildflowers, there are studies that say that happens, and there are studies that say the opposite happens. And it needs a great deal more research. The risks of grazing is that your grazers or your browsers will eat too many of the good forbs that your pollinators need. Or you'll have too many animals and they'll trample nesting sites, or they'll compact the soil. So here's a grazed pasture that I worked on in southern Iowa. And the site had cattle, and it had some rare butterflies, and it had beautiful flowers like butterfly milkweed. This was with a fairly low stocking rate. Then one year, they decided to double the stocking rate, but cut the duration in half. So everything got mowed down to this. Got mowed down to about an inch or 2 by the cattle for 2 months. I had butterfly milkweed plants that I monitored for years. They disappeared that year. The next year, most of them hadn't come back. The year after that, some of them hadn't come back. So really, really intensive grazing can wipe things out. So you have to watch out for that kind of stuff. So some BMPs for grazing, develop systems that have proper utilization rates, and it's really difficult. Again, there's not not a lot of papers published on this yet. What are the right utilization rates? You need to allow for proper recovery, and the key is to go out there and monitor what's happening to the vegetation. And that's the main point of this final BMP on this slide. I'm going to speed up. A very, very brief treatment of mechanical control. Of course, you want to avoid soil disturbance where possible. Of course, species that resprout will need special care. But what about species that don't resprout? We're very lucky in Oklahoma in that our most noxious plant, eastern red cedar, does not resprout. So here's a neat example of a rancher in southern Oklahoma named Bruce Reynolds, had 1,700 acres of tallgrass prairie ranch with most of it invaded by red cedars. So this is a very serious brush control problem. He got a bulldozer. He got bulldozers with help from NRCS and knocked them down and then burned them. And what was the product? Fantastic pollinator habitat. So I, at this point, am a big proponent of mechanical disturbance. And so that's what I've just done on my property this fall. I've got 10 acres, and we had about 1,200 cedars, and we got rid of about 1,000 of them. I cut a few hundred, and I paid somebody a lot of money to get rid of the rest. A lot of money, far more money than I thought. It's very painful. But what I'm going to get, I predict, is amazing pollinator habitat down the road. Okay, I want to talk about some cool resources that Xerces has. We've got this very new interceding guide. So if you have a grassy area and it doesn't have many wildflowers in it, perhaps it's a CRP that was planted just to grass without many forbs, there is a solution. You can interseed. It doesn't always work, but this report, which coworkers of mine, it's 44 pages of guidance on how to make that work, how to get forbs into existing grasslands. And we have a much briefer brochure, and I have a few copies here that I'll put on a table at some point. Coming soon is our guide on how to manage diverse stands of wildflowers. And so this is long-term management of wildflower stands. Given that I work for NRCS, I have to talk about these resources. These are monarch-focused books. These are books featuring important plants for the monarchs. This is our book for the southern Great Plains. We have about 100 great plant species in there for monarchs, and each one we have a 2-page account. We also have a book like that for the Midwest, which covers the region in red. If you want to get this document, it's a free download at NRCS Monarchs. Okay, I want to thank Iris and Caroline and Claudia, who I haven't met yet. Claudia, pleased to meet you, Claudia, and other organizers of this event. Thanks also to the sponsors. It's my pleasure to be here. Also have to acknowledge the supporters of the Xerces Society, most importantly members, of course, but a variety of sponsors of my organization. Thank you very much for the time.
Any questions?
Have you gotten to do any patch burn grazing on some of your prescribed grazing sites?
Have I gotten to do any patch burn grazing? That was the focus of my dissertation work. So
yes, you have.
Yeah, yes, indeed. I've been on patch burn grazing sites in Oklahoma, Kansas, Missouri, Iowa, and Nebraska. And it works. It works. Now, yes. Any specific questions about it?
Well, I was wondering if you are able to work with NRCS to develop BMPs for that to be an applicable practice within their prescribed grazing programs.
No, I have not. I have not had. I'm still pretty new, and I have not had any influence on NRCS practice standards. I will say, I should have mentioned this before, Xerces Society colleagues of mine are writing a document on how to manage rangeland for pollinators. And that's going to come out this year, and it's going to feature patch burn grazing. Probably be a couple pages on how, our thoughts about patch burn grazing and pollinators.